Our next presentation is being done by someone who is not in country, but is doing work in no less in service of the country. Let me just, we were supposed to have Miss Jerusa Ali. Hey, okay, wonderful. You're here to, you're gonna,
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I actually thought Marion Bethel would be right here, but I'll adjust my introduction to her. My name is Jerusa Ali. I'm the Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I've been working with Marion Bethel for quite some time. Before I was in this role, I was an academic and a researcher in international human rights law and international criminal law. So I had an opportunity to work as a research assistant for several members of UN treaty monitoring bodies, including Marion Bethel. She's had 2 terms on the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination of Status Against Women, and she's most recently been elected to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. I've been working with her, well, not I, my bureau, Human Rights and Human Security. The Bahamas is actually the first Ministry of Foreign Affairs to have a dedicated bureau to human rights and human security. And that bureau helped support her campaign to be elected to a regional human rights body, which is, they're both deserved of a big clap for that. It's a first for the Bahamas. I know that, yeah. Clap for human rights, please. The subject of this video presentation and our Q&A is the right to self-determination. And it's a right that really most people associate with decolonization, a colonial context, and moments, post-colonial moments. But it is part of our present, it's part of our historical present and our present. And it is a right that's well defined in international human rights law, but it's also a normative concept. And I hope in watching the video recording from Marion Bethel, you'll get to understand more about this right, and we can have a dialogue about any other questions that you have. So I will press play. Ready?
Good evening to everyone here present, and I'm really pleased to be here with you this evening, virtually, if not in person. I wish I could be there. Firstly, I'd like to thank Dr. Ian Strawn and his vision of this democracy conference. I think it's the 4th annual conference, and I thank him for inviting me to be here. This presentation is on the right to self-determination and human rights and democracy in the Bahamas, and the right to self-determination of the people of Palestine. The international legal order, as defined primarily by the United Nations of 1945, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, international law and human rights law, is facing extraordinary challenges in regard to the flagrant abandonment and flouting of fundamental legal norms by states parties. This challenge to the democratic international order is not only relevant to the critical and urgent question of the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people and the attendant prevention of genocide and ethnic cleansing, but it is also of grave concern for other regions of the world where fundamental rights and freedoms are violated with wanton recklessness and impunity. This must be of concern to all of us as Bahamian citizens and all of us who are activists in a regional and international civil society. The question at hand is whether we in the Bahamas will uphold an international legal order based on the principles of the United Nations Charter and human rights, and if so, how will we do so, and how will we hold ourselves accountable as a state party on one hand, and as civil society actors on the other hand? In this presentation, I want to highlight 3 markers or milestones in our own Bahamian history that may help us navigate this question. 3 markers that can anchor our moral and legal obligation in advancing international law, human rights, and fundamental rights and freedoms generally, and in particular, the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people and the prevention of genocide. The 3 Bahamian landmarks that I will refer to are: 1, the Bahamas' petition before the UN Special Committee in 1965, seeking redress in regard to our right to self-determination. In this event, the Bahamas as a colonial country sought to advance its own democratic order by using a UN mechanism called the UN Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples of 1960. The second landmark is the Nassau Accords of 1985, addressing the right to self-determination and apartheid in South Africa, and the resulting implementation of international sanctions on South Africa. In this event and process, the Bahamas as a sovereign nation and member of the Commonwealth sought to advance the global democratic order and agenda by using its platform and leadership at CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meetings, to advance the right to self-determination of the Black African majority in South Africa and to dismantle the apartheid regime. And thirdly, I will look at the Bahamas as a sovereign nation, having ratified several UN conventions, is now required under the United Nations Charter and international law to advance the right to self-determination, the prevention of genocide, and the provision of humanitarian aid in regard to the people of Palestine. At this historical juncture, both the state and civil society of the Bahamas have the tools at hand to strengthen our democratic order domestically, regionally, and internationally by complying with or employing these treaties or conventions in regard to our legal obligations and responsibility in the international democratic and legal order. As a preamble to this presentation, let me state that on 18th of September 1973, the UN General Assembly admitted the Bahamas into the United Nations. It was then as a sovereign nation that the Bahamas committed itself to upholding and advancing the principles and values of the United Nations Charter of 1945 and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. One of the principles of the UN Charter is that of maintaining peace and security in conformity with the principles of justice and international law as set out in Article 1 of the UN Charter. Further, Article 2 of the UN Charter underscores the development of international cooperation based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. The principle of the right to self-determination encompasses the right of peoples to decide their own political status, their own government, and questions of independence, the legitimacy of elections, and the legitimacy of governments. This right has its historical roots in colonialism and the process of decolonization. I now turn to the first landmark, the Bahamas' petition to the UN Special Committee in 1965. While the right to self-determination is enshrined under international law as set forth in the UN Charter, rights generally exist on 3 levels: the recognition of the right, the exercise of the right, and the enjoyment or fulfillment of the right. In essence, a people have to claim and actualize their right to self-determination. By January 1967, when the Bahamas achieved majority rule, the people of the Bahamas had struggled long and hard to advance and fulfill our right to self-determination. This journey started long before the post-World War II period. Our enslaved ancestors struggled for their freedom throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, and our foreparents continued the struggle post-1834 into the post-World War II period. It was on August 23, 1965, pursuant to Clause 2 of the United Nations Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples of 1960, that the then opposition party, the Progressive Liberal Party, was granted a hearing before the UN Special Committee of 24 at the UN in New York. Clause 2 of this UN declaration states as follows: all peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Closed quotes. The Bahamas' delegation of 8 members, led by Lyndon O. Pindling, leader of the opposition, comprised of other members of the Progressive Liberal Party, namely Clarence Bain, Milo Butler, and Arthur Hanna, who had been elected to the House of Assembly in the 1962 elections. It also included Cecil Wallace Whitfield, the Secretary General of the PLP, Arthur Folkes, and Dr. Doris Johnson, who were defeated in the 1962 elections. And finally, there was Reverend Dr. Harcourt W. Brown, a strong supporter of the PLP, who was also a member of this delegation before the United Nations. In a summary of the proceedings before the UN Special Committee, as laid out in Dr. Doris Johnson's book, The Quiet Revolution, Lyndon Pindling addressed the UN Special Committee on 5 issues, namely A, the labor trade union situation, which had not greatly improved in spite of the general strike of 1958 and the subsequent 1958 reforms. B, the immigration policy, which sought to bring in white foreign workers, especially into the Freeport area. And C, the underfunding of public education for the Black majority. D, the limited social services available to the Black majority. And E, electoral reform in the spirit of the Bahamas' Constitution of 1964. In regard to the pivotal issue of electoral reform, Lyndon Pindling framed it in the context of the principles of self-determination and majority rule of the Bahamian people. The text reads as follows, and I quote, "The Constitutional Conference of 1964, which had been held after the 1962 elections, failed to establish a system to meet the 2 basic requirements, majority rule and the right of each citizen to have his vote counted at equal value. The distribution of seats, which had been embodied in the report of the Constitution, had been presented to the participants of the conference on a take it or leave it basis, and it had not been possible to discuss it. Moreover, since the coming into force of the 1964 Constitution, the United Bahamian Party had seemed determined not to abide by the spirit of that Constitution, and the result was even more glaring inequality and electoral representation. The present order, Constitution's order, on constituencies contained gross inequalities and did not provide for majority rule. That was the most pressing issue which had prompted the petitioners to appeal to the special committee and had given rise to demonstrations by thousands of people all over the island of New Providence. The government had been adamant in opposing the repeal of the order on constituencies, since that order in its present form still left the political control of the islands in the hands of a small minority of the people. In such circumstances, the opposition could no longer fulfill its function. It could not lend itself to what was in fact nothing more than a dictatorship disguised as a democracy. In order to have a fair evaluation and distribution of the seats, the present order should be revoked in toto and new recommendations should be made based upon the principle of majority rule. The people of the Bahamas hoped that the special committee would use its good offices to induce the United Kingdom to establish on the islands a system by which the voice of the majority could be heard and the principle of majority rule observed. In summary, Pindling's delegation would like the UN Special Committee to recommend the revocation of the existing constituencies order, which impeded the free expression of the majority will of the Bahamian people and denied them the right to self-determination, closed quotes. In Michael Creighton's biography of Lyndon Pindling, called Pindling, the Life and Time of the First Prime Minister of the Bahamas, Creighton states, what the opposition wanted, instead of independence before the UN Special Committee, was the pressure of international opinion to be brought to bear upon the UK government to fulfill its duty as the administrating power under the United Nations principles, to facilitate the peaceful progress towards majority rule and self-determination, closed quotes. The then British Empire was facing the dynamic challenges of nationalist movements in African countries such as Ghana and Kenya, Asian countries such as India and Malaysia, and Caribbean countries such as Jamaica and Trinidad. And post-World War II, we saw the beginning of the Cold War between the two dominant powers of the USSR and the USA, allied with Western Europe. Further, the launch of Sputnik in 1957 by the USSR deepened the Western perception of the increasing threat of communism and socialism in Eastern Europe, Asia, Africa, and Cuba. During the post-World War II era in the Bahamas, the struggle for majority rule and the right to self-determination took place against the dramatic backdrop of decisive social and political movements, namely the Burma Road riots of 1942, the labor movement of the 1940s, 50s, and the general strike of 1958, the USA-Bahamas Contract of 1943 to 1963, the women's suffrage movement, the formation of the Progressive Liberal Party in 1953, and the United Bahamian Party in 1958, and the crucial constitutional reform movement and Black Tuesday of April 1965. All of these movements were impacted by the larger anti-colonial, anti-imperialist nationalist movements of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s within the Bahamas, the Caribbean region, and the wider Commonwealth. And so it was that on January 10, 1967, the Bahamas realized the fulfillment of the right to self-determination in alignment with the UN Charter. I now turn to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting called CHOGM, or the Nassau Accords, in the Bahamas of 1985. And this is the second marker of the Bahamas in regard to self-determination, the right to self-determination. During the same period that the Bahamas was fighting for its right to majority rule and self-determination, the Black African majority of South Africa was also fighting for its right to majority rule and self-determination in the face of a white minority government and racial segregation known as apartheid. The system was formalized into government policy through a series of discriminatory laws and practices. The Black African majority was dispossessed of their land, subjected to forced removals, and denied basic political, social, and economic rights. There ensued a violent and bloody protracted struggle between the resistance groups of the Black majority, such as the African National Congress, and the armed forces of the South African government. International campaigns for economic sanctions against South Africa gained strength in the 1980s, and there were two heads of state that continued to support the apartheid regime, namely President Reagan in the USA and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher of England. Both Reagan and Thatcher condemned Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress as communists, and both were listed as terrorists. In October 1985, the Bahamas hosted the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, or CHOGM, under the leadership of Prime Minister Lyndon Pindling. In the biography of Pindling, Creighton states, open quotes, three major issues concerned the Nassau CHOGM meeting: the international economic order, the plight of small nations in the world order, and the critical situation in apartheid South Africa, closed quotes. The all-consuming issue was that of apartheid in South Africa and the question of using international economic sanctions, including boycott and divestment, to end the apartheid regime in South Africa. The Nassau CHOGM was important and significant because its outcome added to the growing pressure on South Africa to dismantle the system of apartheid, to recognize the right of majority rule and the right to self-determination of the Black African majority. Pindling's leadership during the October 1985 Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, hosted in the Bahamas, led to the agreement for collective international economic sanctions against South Africa, as discussed in the CHOGM's Nassau Accords. The Nassau Accords triggered a series of events that led to the eventual release of Nelson Mandela, the abolition of apartheid, the right to majority rule, and the right to self-determination of the Black African majority. South Africa held its first democratic elections in 1994. Selinden, in a speech at the then College of the Bahamas in November 1985, set out his government's position on apartheid. And I open quotes. Creighton, in his biography, says the following: "The Prime Minister described for his audience the brutal realities behind the generic term apartheid, condemned the intransigence of the white regime and the falsity of its professed willingness to make changes, and argued that the only remaining way to effect significant change was the imposition of sanctions by the international community." Closed quotes. Upon release from prison in 1999, President Nelson Mandela, on his first trip abroad, visited the Bahamas to thank Selinden and the Bahamas for the pivotal role that it had played in the Nassau Accords. I want to highlight at this point also the role that civil society in the Bahamas played in regard to sanctions against South Africa. I was the coordinator of a group of civil society actors in April 1979 that came together to advance a boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against apartheid South Africa and in support of the right to self-determination of the Black African majority. The members of the Bahamas Committee on South Africa, as we called ourselves, were Beryl Hanna, Brenville Hanna, Dr. Sandra Dean Patterson, Michael Barnett, Fred Mitchell, Robert Grant, Father James Palacios, Vern Darville, Sean McQueenie, Philip Smith, and Obi Wilchcombe. During the launch of the Bahamas Committee on South Africa, we called on all political parties, civic organizations, and the Bahamian people to take a stand on the issue of apartheid in South Africa. In championing South Africa's right to self-determination and majority rule, and the consequent implementation of sanctions to achieve the same, it is my view that the Bahamas, both the state and civil society, have established a precedent for similar support in regard to the fulfillment of the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. I now turn to the third marker, historical marker in the Bahamas, in regard to the right to self-determination. And it is about the Bahamas' ratification of several UN conventions, United Nations conventions, that require the Bahamas to take positive actions in regard to the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people and the prevention of their genocide. In 1975, shortly after its admission to the United Nations, the Bahamas ratified the following conventions: the Genocide Convention and the Geneva Conventions, which require that the Bahamas take actions to prevent the genocide by Israel and ensure compliance by Israel in the provision of humanitarian aid in this current crisis. In fact, the Bahamas enacted a domestic legislation on genocide under Chapter 85 of the Statute Laws of the Bahamas in alignment with the Genocide Convention. Under Article 1 of the Genocide Convention, the Bahamas, and I open quotes, confirms that genocide, whether committed in time of peace or in time of war, is a crime under international law, which it undertakes to prevent and to punish. In addition, all states parties to the Geneva Convention have the obligation, while respecting the Charter of the United Nations and international law, to ensure compliance by Israel with international humanitarian law as embodied in that convention. It prohibits murder, torture, and brutality against protected persons and establishes their fundamental rights to respect for their person, family, and property, regardless of their race, nationality, or religion. The convention ensures that civilians are treated with humanity and protects them from discrimination and abuse by occupying powers. The Bahamas has further ratified several UN conventions which affirm the right to self-determination. Article 1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights both confirm that, and I quote, all peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development, close quotes. The Bahamas ratified these two covenants in 2008 as a sovereign nation. In the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice of July 19th, 2024, requested by the UN General Assembly under Article 96 of the UN Charter, in regard to the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, the ICJ, or the court, states, with regard to the right to self-determination, the court considers that while it is for the General Assembly and the Security Council to pronounce on the modalities required to ensure an end to Israel's illegal presence in the occupied Palestinian territory and the full realization of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, all states must cooperate with the United Nations to put these modalities into effect. As recalled in the Declaration on Principles of International Law concerning friendly nations and cooperation among states in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, every state has the duty to promote, through joint and separate action, realization of the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples in accordance with the provisions of the UN Charter, and to render assistance to the United Nations in carrying out the responsibilities entrusted to it by the Charter regarding the implementation of the principle. It is for all states, while respecting the Charter of the United Nations and international law, to ensure that any impediment resulting from the illegal presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory to the exercise of the Palestinian people of its right to self-determination is brought to an end. Any impediment is brought to an end in regard to the exercise of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. I now return to my question at the opening of this presentation. The question remains whether we in the Bahamas will uphold an international legal order based on the principles of the United Nations Charter and human rights, and if so, how will we do so? And how will we hold ourselves accountable as a state party on one hand, and as civil society actors on the other hand, in regard to the right to self-determination of the people of Palestine? Given our own history and our own struggle for the right to self-determination in the Bahamas, given our work at CHOGM and the Nassau Accords in regard to exercise of the right to self-determination of South Africa, and in light of the several United Nations conventions that we have signed on to upholding the right to self-determination, it is, in my view, that we owe it to the Palestinian people to facilitate and support their right to self-determination. And I thank you for this presentation. Thank you so very much.
All right, an important question and a rich historical context. I'd open the floor for discussion or questions. You might still be processing. Sure. Alicia?
I really appreciate having the historical grounding and really zeroing in on the role that the Bahamas has played in issues of justice internationally and the voluntary participation of the Bahamas as a state in international mechanisms and in particular United Nations mechanisms. Because when we talk about them in public, just in general, there is this resistance and this idea that this is a foreign agenda, but this is something that is very real for the Bahamas and that has been leveraged for the good of the Bahamian people and for the good of people in other parts of the world, including South Africa. So I really appreciate that, and I think that's something that we have to hold on to and to contextualize for ourselves now. And I think another question to add to Marion's is, how did we get here? To a place where we are reaching for excuses to remain inactive rather than really paying attention to all of the reasons that exist for us to see the connections between our struggles and the struggles that people are having in other parts of the world, and in particular in Palestine, where there's an active genocide going on and there is action that we can take, including using social media. And of course, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement was mentioned, where connecting to all kinds of other sessions from day one and day two of this conference, being conscious consumers and being careful about how we spend our money. So I think there's a lot that was in here for us to think about, and I think the silence in the room is kind of an indication of whether or not we have been thinking about it before and how we're still wrestling with the same issues, or backing away from them and finding all of the excuses for continued inaction and reasons why we can't. But we absolutely can.
I guess this is more like a comment, but I can have a comment on your comment. The multilateral space uses a completely different discourse, and matters are discussed in closed chambers, and the right to self-determination is complicated. It's often equated with the right to state recognition, and it's not the same. So we do participate at many levels, regional, international, sometimes intergovernmental, in support of the right of self-determination of all peoples, including peoples that are close to our shore, like Turks and Caicos. But for me, as somebody who's, and I'm speaking as me rather than, I'm not a representative of the government today, it's hard to understand and hard to follow the actions that are taken by states in recognition of this right to self-determination. So even as a practitioner in that space, it's a difficult space to navigate. And Marion Bethel has identified two areas where there needs to be state action and there needs to be civil society action. And from my childhood and my memory, in the case of apartheid South Africa, state action and civil society action were in step. They were locked in step. We recently had an official visit, the South African Acting High Commissioner, who came for Emancipation Day. And you could tell that she came with gratitude because of the actions that Bahamians, state actors and civil society actors took during the CHOGA, Commonwealth Heads of Government, and outside in other spaces and in lobbying other states. But I really appreciate the comment, and I think there was another hand.
So my question has to do with it's kind of connected to what Alicia stated, and the UN and the ways in which we could use the UN, and then also the power of the UN. And so last November, I was able to get a fellowship with the United Nations. So I was a United Nations fellow with the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent. And I state that because I was the first Bahamian to apply for the fellowship. The program has been in existence for, when I did it was 10 years. And my experience in going to the fellowship, because it is in Geneva, was that our perception of what the UN is in the Bahamas is very different from one, what it actually is, and then being there with 10 other fellows from how I think people in our region perceive the United Nations. I was there, and I applied really from the perspective of being a scholar, and then got there and realized like that doesn't matter, you know. Not that it doesn't matter, but that there were people there that were not scholars. There were people there that were just doing the work of civil society. There were, you know, young people there, but they were all doing very important work. But this perception of like the organization as being sort of elite was not something that persons, I think, from Central America or South America had the same perceptions of. Like they really saw the organization as a tool to help advocate the different movements that they were leading. And I was so wondering why you think we in the Bahamas kind of perceive the United Nations as being this foreign entity that has come to kind of place their worldly ideals on us, you know, and try and shape us into something that we don't necessarily want to be. That's the perception that I get often. And then also, if the United Nations does have any power, right? We see all of these movements, like the ruling from the ICJ, and you know, that the United Nations is a body that is funded by, you know, works by those who fund them, and the US being a primary funder. So what is the power that the organization really has? And then also, how can we in the Bahamas use that power to our benefit and change kind of the way that we perceive the organization?
Right, there's a lot to unpack there. I can answer with mainly my opinion, and then give some descriptions of UN and UN institutions and agencies. The UN has a political base in New York, which is less accessible for small states, for civil society, for anyone. In the case of the Bahamas, until now, we had never proposed a candidature for the UN Security Council, a non-permanent seat. We're doing that now, to try and find a space to agenda set, a space for a small island developing state. But it will probably take us 6 years to run a campaign. We'll need support of our region. CARICOM will need the support of a group of Latin American states as well. So you have New York, less accessible to small states, less accessible to civil society, and the political, let's call it the capital, political capital of the UN. Then you have Geneva, let's call it the human rights and humanitarian capital of the UN. All of those institutions are slightly more accessible to small island states, to civil society, and they maintain certain consultative mechanisms that we're not always a part of. The Economic and Social Council of the United Nations has criteria for NGOs, which make it restrictive and difficult to navigate. In our history, we've really only had one organization that was able to gain ECOSOC status as an NGO, and some other small island developing states have over 20 or even over 100. So Geneva as human rights capital, more accessible, but there's certain pathways to that access, and you managed to get one way of accessing. This is You, you deserve a hand. You have to apply. You have to, you have to watch rolling applications for whatever you are involved in. If you're an academic, there might be a route to a fellowship. If you're a researcher, there might be an opening for a human rights body. If you want to become a diplomat, you can request to be posted to Geneva. You can work for the Bahamas government. You can also work for another government as a Bahamian national. So Geneva is slightly more open, but we still haven't taken advantage of that space. Then you move to Nairobi, which is like the development capital of the UN. And we're underrepresented in that space. So Nairobi is about development, it's about environment. At present, we don't have any diplomatic mission there, although we have had Bahamians who've worked for UNEP and other agencies based in Nairobi. And then I could go on because there are many other, but I would signal those as three very powerful spaces where everyone who has an interest should try and penetrate those spaces, whether it's through diplomacy or academe or activism. When they're aligned, we're able to agenda set and make our voice heard. But it is difficult because we are small. The UN has one country, one vote, but we are still small. So we're part of small island states, small state diplomacy.
I have a question. So I've only been in the Bahamas a few.
Of our diplomacy and the pressure probably from larger states. You can often feel pressured to take on the opinion and the position of one of the permanent five of the Security Council. But I would say that we have consistent, because we are new. 1973, we're a new state, and we've engaged in principal diplomacy. So we don't engage in transactional diplomacy. We engage in transformational diplomacy and reciprocity. Now, we probably don't discuss this very much. So all the appearances can be that we're being tugged between P5. But in fact, when we vote, we look for reciprocity. We look for consistency. We have a very solid voting record on the right to self-determination. But I can say that we do face pressure. And for some small island states, sometimes that pressure is insurmountable and they have to make tough decisions. But we haven't reached that point yet. And wherever possible, we stand in solidarity with other small island states, such as CARICOM, another body that bridges Pacific and Caribbean Commonwealth, and AOSIS. That's our strength, but it isn't easy.
So I just I wanted to be clear, maybe for those who are, not just me, but others who are listening. I was under the impression that we've always made the right decision with respect to self-determination where Palestine was concerned historically. What's the gap now? What ought we to be doing that we aren't in terms of our record but where we are today? Could you be specific?
Well, this is my opinion, but I think there needs to be a marriage between state and civil society. That is our strength. Perhaps we need to learn more. We need to read more. It's, I'm open to dialogue. Our political circumstances we've struggled together. So we have empathy. So we understand. We have a good understanding. But we don't always have exposure to empathize with particular movements of self-determination of peoples. So I'd actually like to know more, and maybe we should have a civil society consultation that is, prior to a moment in that UN calendar. The fall is a General Assembly in New York. By the time we get to the spring, it's Geneva. Maybe we should have a civil society dialogue amongst ourselves and support each other.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yes, thank you. Could you speak to the fact that the UK and the French and other countries in the world have recognized the Palestinian state? And where is the Bahamas in that process? I might be not correct in this, but I thought we had also recognized the Palestinian state in the Bahamas.
Yes, so the recognition of statehood is at 157 UN member states. The states can be recognized. There are two schools of state recognition. There's a declaratory and there's a constitutive. And usually our state recognition is based on the Montevideo Convention, and there's certain criteria. So the state must have a permanent population, a defined territory, a government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. But there are times when statehood ultimately relies on recognition, and that recognition can take the form of political recognition. So that's what's happened, 157 political recognition.
So the Bahamian government, beyond that declaratory recognition step, we could actually do things like invite a Palestinian official to be to appoint an ambassador to our country as a step towards doing something more than simply being expressing a declaration of recognition. I mean, I think Dr. Strong's question is a good one. What specifically could the Bahamas do, both, at the international level, to take us beyond the point of simply being a state that declares the recognition of the Palestinian people, their statehood? Just a few things that our government could do beyond what is done already.
I guess I'm being asked for a roadmap, but this is a political question, right? And I'm just a technical bureaucrat. But I think it's important to mention that our foreign policy is really formed in consensus with other CARICOM states. And the Caribbean community, which has political, cultural, and historical roots, allows states that we've recognized to appoint a plenipotentiary representative, and that's been done for Palestine. I'm not sure of the awareness of that.
Can you speak a little bit more to that particular point, please? And in terms
As
of
a-
what that means.
CARICOM is, it's our regional base. Its structure is a little bit different. It's post-colonial. It was Anglophone until Haiti became a member. It's united politically, it's united economically. There are some differences within the organization, but we stand as one. We have associate members who we also support for self-determination. Some other regional organizations are structured in such a way as states can appoint or apply to become an observer. And so then they have a more active role in decision-making and in summitry and meetings and conferences. But for CARICOM, because our organization has such deep political, cultural, ethnic roots, we are the Caribbean. And we've created a space for other countries to appoint a plenipotentiary. So it's a senior ranking diplomatic representative. And we've created a space for special guests, and that's a consultative mechanism. So when you appoint a plenipotentiary, when you become a special guest, you have an opening for dialogue at the ministerial level and the head of government, head of state level, and that is important.
And just follow up, I'm sorry, Dr. Strong, but
I hope I'm not boring you.
no, this is very important. This representative, are they now in the Caribbean?
I think, well, right this second, I'm not sure. Because almost everyone, including my minister, Fred Mitchell, is in New York. But the practice for CARICOM is that the person who is appointed as a plenipotentiary does not have to be physically resident in Georgetown, Guyana, which is where CARICOM is based. So you can appoint, I'm trying to think of an example from another state. We recently had a visit from New Zealand. So the New Zealand High Commissioner, Linda Teapuni, is a plenipotentiary representative to CARICOM based in Wellington, New Zealand.
So the Bahamian government could invite that representative to the Bahamas.
You have to reach out to us bureaucrats.
Right. But it's possible.
Yes.
So I just have I'm just been trying to get an understanding. In the case of the situation with Palestine, the Bahamas, to my understanding, has voted in support of just about every resolution that's come forth within the last year in regards to Palestine. Of course, the United States, depending on what the resolution is, majority of them have vetoed them if they call for action, has moved to sanction the International Criminal Court, has threatened to sanction any country that complies with the International Criminal Court, especially those of which historically the United States called allies. So, unlike the situation we had with South Africa, one second, sorry. Yeah, the situation we have with South Africa, this is a very different ball game in terms of the relationship between the state currently being accused and whose leader has a warrant for his arrest for crimes against humanity, and the situation we had in South Africa. And I'm wondering, considering the situation we now have with Venezuela, when we talk about the Bahamas voting in support of countries' right to self-determination, we voted for regime change twice against Venezuela in the Minnis administration in the Organization of American States. So I'm sure there was pressure behind that. That's when we had that infamous photograph of Hubert Minnis, the Haitian president, Andrew Holness, and I think a few other Caribbean leaders sitting by the emergency exit at Mar-a-Lago. And my reason for bringing this up is I'm confused as to where the direction of the discourse is, if it is beyond painfully obvious that the reason we're in this predicament, the reason this whole entire situation is happening is because one nation, who we are exquisitely and explicitly tied to economically, wills it to be the case. And that any time any decision needs to be made about regime change, specifically in our region, there will be pressure applied to us to comply. And we've demonstrated in the past, I don't know why we say that we support these things, that we will vote in support of regime change and denying our own neighbors their right to self-determine. So I'm confused as to the discourse here.
Right, you're asking me to analyze discourse? Within this space particularly.
Yes.
Well, it's confusing. That's why. This is not easily understood. And it's very hard when you're in a region that's a zone of peace and you see fracturing. And it's hard to be that small state when you have regional hegemonic powers and interests. It's very difficult. So I don't think I think all of us should be a little bit confused and try and figure out where we stand and why we are attracted to certain norms, discourses, and legal regimes. How do we understand this problem of the right to self-determination? You know, it's a right that was purposefully not well defined because it's something that emerged during a decolonization period. It was not an explicitly empowering right. So it's still difficult for us to understand. We're in a post-colonial moment. I'm older. Maybe there are some people who remember what it was like to be here during the colonial period, what that order was, what that colonial discourse meant, what that normative regime meant. But this is, we've made every attempt, we as in the Global South has made every attempt to define that right for ourselves and for peoples who are trying to reach for both internal self-determination and external political self-determination. I do think we're more focused on external politics rather than internal realization of rights. I'm not sure if I answered your question. A little bit.
I have a question. I'm concerned, just curious about over here to the left.
Oh, to see.
Yeah, right, my left. I'm just curious about our manpower situation. It wasn't mentioned at all in the talk, but I'm wondering, some years ago, we were scrapping around for people to go to these meetings and really participate. And you mentioned earlier that we are small, of course, but how do we compare to other small countries? I once had to represent the Bahamas in one of these things regarding science and technology. And in my experience, seeing Barbados, they were always there. And they had people, and they're smaller than us. I was wondering, how come we have such difficulty back then? I'm not sure it's still like that now. So I don't know if you could speak to that, if you need more people in that
Sure,
area.
I mean, it's always challenging. So I spoke about New York, Geneva, and Nairobi. Well, there's also Vienna and The Hague. And realistically, we're only 400,000 people. We only have so many representatives. We also don't have very strong and organized diasporic bases abroad. But I am very impressed with Caribbean countries' ability to work together, to negotiate as a unit, to build bridges. We build a bridge with the African Union. We often build bridges with AOSIS, with SIDS within Commonwealth. So it's very common in my profession that I can simply call somebody from another small island state and just say, hey, we're not going to be able to make it to this conference. Will you be there? And they'll say, I'm not sure. Let's call Grenada. We'll get on a group call. Can you share reporting? Can you do a proxy vote? So we have that solidarity and unity, then that's our strength. And not all regions are so solidified through political ties, but even cultural ties. You might even say, you know, when a particular issue comes up, oh, my friend is married to so-and-so who's the minister in Belize, we'll call. And so I think we do diplomacy very differently, and that is part of our strength. But you're right, it's impossible. You cannot attend every meeting. Even for the larger states, by the way.
So I want to thank you for facilitating. We appreciate that you came, and let's give her a hand, please, folks.
Thank you.